She had nothing left. No job, no money, no name anyone could track. Just a river in Oklahoma and a fire she could barely keep alive. 7 days. That is how long she sat there, alone, waiting for something she could not name. Not rescue, not a miracle, just a reason. And on the morning of the 7th day, a man on horseback came down through the fog and looked at her. He could have called the sheriff. He could have told her to move on. He had every right to do exactly that. Instead, he asked 4 words. Just 4. Have you eaten anything today? That question, small, quiet, nothing heroic about it, is the moment this entire story turns on. Because sometimes, the thing that saves a person is not grand or dramatic. Sometimes it is simply someone choosing to see you when they did not have to. This channel is home to stories from the American West tales of cowboys and wide open land, of love that grows slow and true, of the quiet courage between ordinary people, of compassion that costs something, and of the kind of human warmth that reminds us why we are here. What this story will give you is something worth carrying long after it ends. It will remind you that healing does not always look like being saved. Sometimes it looks like someone handing you a piece of bread and a reason to get up tomorrow. Sometimes it looks like work and silence, and 2 people slowly learning to trust again. That is the lesson at the heart of this story, and it is one that belongs to all of us. If this is the kind of story that speaks to something in you, stay with us. Leave a comment and tell us what you felt at the end. Share it with someone who needs to hear it today. And if you have not yet found this channel, subscribe now, because there are many more stories like this one waiting for you here.
Day 7. Maggie Callahan was counting days, not because she wanted to live, but because a small part of her, the part that had worked emergency medicine for 22 years, still hadn't forgotten how to count. The fog was sitting low on the Cimarron River that morning, pressed flat against the water like it hadn't decided to leave yet. October in northwestern Oklahoma had a particular kind of cold, not the brutal kind, the patient kind, the kind that settles into your shoulders and stays there and doesn't announce itself until you realize you've been shivering for an hour without noticing. Maggie sat beside the cold ash of last night's fire and stared at the piece of paper on her knee. It was crumpled. She'd folded it and unfolded it so many times that the creases were starting to tear. At the top, in her own handwriting, careful, precise, the handwriting of a woman who had spent 2 decades writing patient notes that could not afford to be misread, she had written a single heading. Things I did wrong. Below that, a list. This was the 3rd page, the first 2 she had burned. She wasn't wearing her wedding ring anymore. She hadn't been for 2 years since the divorce. But her finger still sometimes registered its absence, the way a body remembers a thing long after the thing is gone. She pressed her thumb against that finger now, held it there. The cattle she could hear but not see lowed somewhere in the gray distance. The river moved the way rivers always move, without any particular interest in the person sitting beside it. Birds crossed overhead. The morning was happening whether she was part of it or not. That indifference was brutal, and strangely, somewhere underneath the brutal, it was almost a relief. Day 1 had been the car. She'd been driving west on US 270, no destination decided, just putting miles between herself and Denver, and the engine had gone quiet on a flat stretch of highway with nothing in any direction but dry grass and sky. She'd sat in the driver's seat for 3 hours. She hadn't called anyone, hadn't waved down a passing truck. She'd simply sat and watched the windshield and felt for the first time in months that she had nowhere to be. Then she'd picked up her bag and walked toward the river she could see glinting in the distance. Days 2 and 3, her hands had done what her hands knew. 2 years of disaster relief medicine, Haiti, coastal Texas, Puerto Rico, had built a kind of muscle memory that didn't require the brain's cooperation. She'd rigged shelter from branches and an emergency tarp from her bag. She'd identified the cleanest stretch of water. She'd done these things without deciding to do them, the way a person who has driven a particular road for 20 years will take the right turns without thinking. Days 4 and 5, the hunger had arrived in earnest, the dizzying kind. She'd caught a small fish with a sharpened stick, badly, embarrassingly, and roasted it over coals and eaten it with both hands like someone who had stopped caring what that looked like. Afterward, she'd stared at her own hands, a surgeon's hands, Hands that had held instruments worth more than most cars, covered in soot and scales and river mud. She'd laughed, alone. The sound surprised her. Day 6, it had rained, and she'd sat in it because the shelter wasn't good enough, and there was no point pretending otherwise. Sitting in the rain, she'd thought about Thomas Hale for the first time. Really thought about him. Not the chart, not the case. Him. The wide smile, the rough hands, the 3 daughters whose names she'd read in the paperwork. She'd thought about his face in those last minutes. The way he'd looked at her, the way he'd nodded, as if he was trying to tell her something. She hadn't let herself decide what. And now it was day 7, and the paper on her knee had a list that didn't get shorter no matter how many times she rewrote it. And Maggie Callahan, who had once run a trauma bay with the authority of someone who had never once doubted she belonged there, was trying to catch a fish with a stick and failing. And she was beginning to think that maybe this particular stretch of Oklahoma riverbank was where her story ended. Not because she wanted it to, but because she couldn't see any further than today. She heard the hoofbeats before she saw him. She turned and looked up the bank, and there was a man on horseback moving along the fence line at a walk. He was checking the wire. She could see that from the way he leaned slightly and watched the posts. He hadn't seen her yet. The fog was still thick enough down near the water. Then he stopped. He'd spotted the shelter, or the ash, or her. He sat on the horse and looked down at her for a long moment. 10 seconds, maybe. Long enough that Maggie had time to go through several internal calculations and arrive at the conclusion that she should be the first one to speak. She stood up, mud to her ankles. Hair she hadn't touched since day 3. The hospital name still printed on the chest of her jacket like a name tag from a life she used to live. She said, voice flat and without apology, "I'll be gone by morning." The man on the horse didn't say that's right. Didn't say this is private property. Didn't reach for his phone, which would have been the sensible thing and well within his rights. He looked at her for another moment. Then he asked, "Have you eaten anything today?" The question was so far from what she had prepared for that she didn't answer. She turned her face away, looked at the river, felt something happen inside her chest that she didn't have the vocabulary for at that particular moment. Something cracking along a line that had been holding for a very long time. The man didn't leave. He sat on his horse in the fog at the top of the riverbank and did not leave. After a while, he reached into his saddlebag and took out something wrapped in wax paper. He came partway down the bank, not all the way, keeping a distance that felt deliberate, the way a person keeps distance from something wounded. And he set the package on a flat rock near the water. He said, "This land's mine, but the river doesn't belong to anybody." Then he turned the horse and rode back the way he came. He didn't look back. Maggie stood in the mud and looked at the package on the rock. A bread roll she found when she unfolded the wax paper. Still slightly warm. She looked in the direction the man had gone. Trees and fog. Nothing moving. She sat down on the rock and ate the bread. Slowly. Small pieces. Old habit. A starved stomach needed to be brought back carefully. She didn't cry while she was eating. She cried after, just for a minute, just enough. Then she sat with the wax paper in her hands and looked at the river and stayed very still while something settled in her. Some question she hadn't known she'd been waiting to have answered. She hadn't expected kindness. She hadn't expected to feel anything when it arrived. The afternoon came and went. The fog lifted and the Oklahoma sky turned the particular shade of blue that has no equivalent anywhere east of the Mississippi. Birds she didn't know the names of moved through the cottonwoods, and in the late afternoon, she heard the hoofbeats again. He came back down to the bank. Different bag this time. A packaged meal from a gas station or a convenience store and a folded wool blanket, worn but clearly clean. He set them down the same way he'd set down the bread, without fuss, without looking directly at her. The way you set food out for something that might be skittish. He said, "I'm not going to ask your name. Don't need to know what happened." He paused. Then, in the same tone he might use to mention that it was supposed to rain tomorrow, he said, "But if you're still here in the morning, I could use someone to help clean out the horse stalls." He left. Maggie sat with the blanket across her shoulders and the packaged meal in her lap, and the wax paper from that morning still in her coat pocket. She didn't understand this man, didn't understand why he'd come back, didn't understand why someone would offer work to a stranger sitting in the mud by a river with no name given and no story asked for. But she understood one thing. She understood that for the first time in 3 months, morning had something in it. That night she pulled the blanket tight and watched the stars come out over Oklahoma. More of them than she'd ever seen from Denver, more than the city had ever allowed. And she slept. Not the collapse of exhaustion. Sleep, real sleep. The kind that requires, somewhere underneath everything, the faint sense that tomorrow is worth arriving at. She was at the ranch gate at 5:58 in the morning. 2 minutes early. She couldn't help it. Some things are trained into you so deeply that crisis doesn't reach them. The ranch was called Reardon. She'd seen the name on the gate post. Cole Reardon. She'd find out the first name later that morning, from his son. The property ran from the road down to the river, a few hundred acres of dry grass and cattle and fence line that seemed to go on longer than any one person could reasonably maintain. Cole was waiting at the gate. He looked at her the way she'd noticed the day before, not sizing her up, not judging, just calculating. How much strength? Whether she'd done this kind of work before, whether she'd still be here at noon, or whether she'd last 2 hours and be gone. He said, "Terms are simple, 6 to noon. Stalls, feeding, fencing, whatever I point you toward. 3 meals a day, a room to sleep in that's not a storage shed. Well, it is a storage shed, but we cleaned it out. No one asks your name. No one asks what happened." She said, "How long?" He said, "As long as you need." She stood with that for a moment. She'd expected a number, a week, 2 weeks, until the weather changes. As long as you need was something she didn't know how to put in a box. She said, "I'm not an ordinary person in an ordinary situation. There are people looking for me." He said, "I know." She said, "You don't know anything about it." He said, "I know enough." The front door of the house opened, and a young man came out carrying 2 mugs of coffee. He was maybe 24, dark-haired, with the easy confidence of someone who had been well-loved since birth, and had never had a reason to doubt it. He came down the porch steps and shook Maggie's hand without any indication that anything about the situation was unusual. He said, "I'm Danny, Dad's son. You want this black or with cream?" Maggie took the mug. "Black." He nodded. "Good call. The cream's been in there a while." She almost smiled. Almost. Cole walked her to the first stall, and that was when the first unexpected thing happened. The cow inside was moving with a hitch in her left rear leg, a particular kind of gait disruption that Maggie clocked in about 4 seconds. She said, "That one's got an infection starting in the hoof. You can see the heat in the tissue when she shifts weight. She needs the area cleaned and packed, and you're going to want to watch for spreading redness over the next 48 hours. Cole stopped walking. He looked at the cow. He looked at Maggie. He said, "What do you know about cattle?" She said, "I know about infection." She didn't explain further. He looked at her for another beat. Then he said, "All right, start with her." And they did. That morning passed in a way that Maggie hadn't expected. Work, it turned out, was a kind of medicine she hadn't known she needed. Not the intellectual work she was accustomed to, not differential diagnosis and patient charts, and the particular mental sprint of emergency medicine. This was different. This was her body moving through space, doing things that required her whole attention in the most basic way. Lifting, carrying, learning where things were kept and why. The particular leverage required to handle a frightened animal, the weight of a bag of feed, the satisfying click of a latch done right. By 11:30, her hands were aching in ways they'd never ached before. Different muscles, different demands. She stood in the yard and felt the sun on her face and registered that she was tired in a clean way. The kind of tired that comes from using yourself up rather than being used up by something you can't see. Danny called her for lunch from the porch. She sat at a kitchen table for the first time in a week. A real chair, a real bowl of soup. Danny sat across from her and talked about his upcoming wedding with the uncomplicated enthusiasm of a person who sees no reason to edit himself around someone he just met. His fiancée's name was Claire. They were getting married in the spring. The venue was a problem. His future mother-in-law had opinions. Cole ate and listened. Maggie listened, too, and somewhere in the middle of it she understood something about this house. There had been someone else here once. A woman, she guessed. A wife. A mother. The absence was the kind you learn to read. In the way the two of them moved around the kitchen, leaving space, being careful, filling in for each other without either of them seeming to notice they were doing it. The missing person had made them careful, not cold, careful. There's a difference. That afternoon she went back to the storage room they'd cleared for her. Old mattress, oil lamp, small window looking out over the field. A hook on the back of the door that someone had put there before she arrived. Recently she could tell from the unweathered wood around the screw. Someone had thought to put a hook on the door so she'd have somewhere to hang her coat. That detail hit her harder than she expected. She sat on the mattress and looked at the hook and thought about Denver. About the apartment she'd been locked out of because the account was frozen. About the hospital where she'd worked for 16 years and where she'd received a certified letter telling her not to return to the premises pending investigation. About Derek Callahan sitting across a conference table with his expensive suit and his careful voice, explaining what he was going to do to her career with the same measured tone he'd once used to explain what they were having for dinner. She thought about Thomas Hale's file, about the night in question, about the chain of decisions, the staffing shortage she'd reported 6 times, the 3rd consecutive overnight shift, the 15 seconds in which she had made the best call she could with the information she had, about the details she'd missed, about whether missing it made her a bad doctor or a tired human or both. She didn't have an answer. She'd been sitting with that question for 3 months, and it hadn't gotten any smaller. But tomorrow, she had somewhere to be. That was new. That evening after dinner, she couldn't sleep. She went outside and sat on the porch steps in the dark, thinking the cool air might help. Cole was already there, sitting in a wooden chair looking out at the fields. She hadn't seen him go out. She sat down on the steps. Neither of them spoke. The night was very quiet. The cattle were settled. Wind moved through the grass and made the sound grass makes. Dry, soft, continuous. After maybe 15 minutes, she said without looking at him, "I used to save people every day. And then one day, I didn't save one. And I don't know how to come back from that." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I know that feeling." 3 words. No elaboration. No follow-up. No pivot to advice or silver lining or the assurance that time heals things. She sat with those 3 words and felt something in her chest that she couldn't fully name. Not comfort, exactly. Something more like recognition. The particular relief of being understood by someone who doesn't need you to explain the whole thing. They sat out there another half hour. Then they both went inside. That night she slept again. Deep and real. The storage room with its oil lamp and its hook on the door and its small window full of stars. For the first time in a long time, she thought, tomorrow there is work. Tomorrow there is somewhere to be. That was enough. For now, that was exactly enough. By the end of the first week, Maggie had learned the geography of the ranch the way you learn a place when you're working it. Not from looking at it, but from moving through it. She knew that the east fence had 3 weak posts that Cole was always meaning to get to and never quite did. She knew that the gray mare in the second stall was prone to anxiety during feeding if you came in too fast. She knew that the water line to the north trough had a slow leak that required the valve to be turned a half rotation tighter than it appeared to need. She knew that Cole was always up before her, no matter how early she woke. She knew that Danny made coffee that was genuinely excellent, and that Cole made coffee that was essentially hot brown water, and that neither of them seemed to notice the difference. She was getting her bearings. It was an unfamiliar feeling, getting one's bearings. She'd spent 22 years in an environment where she always knew exactly where she was. The ER had its rhythms, its geography, its unwritten laws. She had been the person other people oriented themselves around. Now she was learning a new place from the ground up, and it was harder than she expected, and also, quietly, something she had not known she needed. On the 4th morning, Danny found her in the north pasture trying to repair a section of fence and showed her a better method for setting the wire without losing the tension. He was patient about it in the way of someone who has been taught well, not talking down to her, just demonstrating. She said, "Where'd you learn this?" He said, "Dad. He learned it from his dad. I guess it goes back pretty far." She said, "Your grandfather worked this land?" He said, "His grandfather, actually, 4 generations. Dad's the one who almost lost it when the cattle prices dropped in 2012. But he worked about 3 jobs for 2 years and kept it. Mom was still alive then." He said that last part simply, not as an invitation to ask further, just as a fact. Maggie said, "When did she pass?" He said, 6 years ago, cancer, pretty fast once they found it." He paused, and then he said, "Dad never really talked about it much afterward. I think talking about it meant he had to figure out what to do next, and I don't think he wanted to figure that out." Maggie filed that away without comment. That afternoon, the gray mare started showing signs of respiratory distress. Not severe, but enough that Maggie watched the breathing pattern for a few minutes, and then went to find Cole. She said, "The mare's breathing faster than she should be. Upper respiratory, not lower, based on where the effort is sitting. I'd want to watch her overnight and call your vet in the morning if she's not improved. Is she current on vaccinations?" Cole looked at her. He said, "You're not from agricultural medicine." She said, "No." He said, "But you know what you're looking at." She said, "I know what illness looks like. The specifics vary." He held her gaze for a moment. Then he said, "She's current. I'll check on her at midnight." She said, "I'll check at 10. We can split it." He looked at her for another beat. Then he nodded. Just that. A nod. It was not a thank you. It was something more practical than a thank you. It was an acknowledgement that she was useful, that she was here, and it mattered that she was here. She had not realized until that moment how much she had needed someone to tell her that. That evening, Ruth McAllister came by. She was 68, and she moved like someone who had made a decision a long time ago not to let age convince her of anything. And she carried an apple pie and a dish towel, and she walked into Cole's kitchen without knocking. She looked at Maggie for a long time. Maggie looked back. Ruth said, "So you're the one?" Maggie said, "I suppose I am." Ruth set the pie on the table. She poured herself a cup of Cole's terrible coffee without being invited, and she sat down and she said, "Cole Reardon has been living on this property like a piece of furniture for 6 years. Functioning. Present. Technically alive." She paused. "Since you showed up, his light's been on an hour earlier every morning. I live close enough to notice." Maggie said, "I start work at 6. He's usually already up." Ruth said, "He was up at 7 before. 7:30 some days." She picked up her coffee cup. "I'm not telling you what to do with that information. I'm just telling you what it is." Maggie didn't say anything. Ruth didn't seem to require her to. When Cole came in from outside, Ruth talked to both of them about the fence situation on the county road, and about the upcoming winter feed prices, and about Danny's wedding plans, and she ate 2 pieces of her own pie and left without ceremony. After she was gone, Cole and Maggie cleaned up the kitchen together. He washed. She dried. The window above the sink showed the dark field and the first stars. He said without turning around, "Ruth means well." She said, "I think she says what she means. That's different from meaning well." He was quiet for a moment. Then something that might have been the beginning of a smile moved across his face and disappeared. She filed that away, too. The next morning she came across a problem she didn't know how to solve. A section of the drainage system near the south barn that was backed up and causing pooling. She spent 20 minutes looking at it. Then she went and found Cole and described what she was seeing. He came and looked at it. He crouched down and studied it. Then he looked at her. He said, "You could have just fixed it wrong and hoped I wouldn't notice." She said, "I don't do things wrong if I can help it." He said, "I know." He stood up. "That's the problem sometimes." She looked at him. He was already moving to get the right tool. She stood there for a moment in the October sun, with mud on her boots and her hands already rougher than they'd been a week ago. And she thought, what does that mean? That's the problem sometimes. She thought about it for the rest of the day and didn't arrive at a satisfying answer. But she noticed that she was thinking about something other than Thomas Hale. That was new. The end of the first week arrived, and she did not leave. She had told herself she would figure out her next move by the weekend. She hadn't figured it out, but when she sat with the question honestly, she found she wasn't ready to leave. Not because she was afraid of what was outside, not even because she had nowhere to go. Because something here was happening to her that she didn't want to interrupt. She couldn't name it exactly, but every morning she woke up and went to work, and every evening she sat at a table where someone had made food, and every night she slept in a room that had a hook on the door that someone had put there for her. And slowly, quietly, without ceremony, she was beginning to remember what it felt like to be a person rather than a problem. She sat in the storage room that Friday evening and wrote a single line on a clean page. Not the list this time, just one line. She wrote, "I am still here." She looked at it for a while, then she folded it and put it in her coat pocket and went to check on the gray mare, who was breathing easily and was perfectly fine. The second week was where things began to settle into something. Not a routine, exactly. More like a rhythm. The kind that develops between people who work alongside each other for enough hours that the work itself becomes a kind of conversation. Cole didn't talk much. She'd understood that from the beginning. He communicated largely through what he did, where he put things, how he moved through the day, what he stopped to fix, and what he left alone. Maggie, who had spent her whole career in an environment of constant high-volume communication, found this disorienting at first and then gradually something close to restful. She started to understand his silences the way you learn to read a foreign language, slowly, imperfectly, but then with increasing confidence. This silence meant he was working through a problem. This one meant he was satisfied with how a thing had gone. This one, the one that came with a slight tension in his jaw, meant something was wrong that he wasn't going to say out loud unless pressed. She didn't press. She watched. On the 8th day, they were moving cattle from one pasture to another, and something went sideways. A fence gap that shouldn't have been there, a section of herd that didn't want to go where they were directed. And what should have been a 2-hour job became a 4-hour one in the full heat of the afternoon. They were muddy and tired, and neither of them was talking much by the time they finished. They leaned against the fence post in the shade of a single cottonwood tree and drank from water bottles without speaking. After a while, Cole said, "You did good today." She said, "I had no idea what I was doing for the first 45 minutes. He said, "I know. You still did good." She looked sideways at him. He was looking out at the pasture. His face in profile, weathered from years of exactly this kind of work, showed nothing in particular. But she had learned enough about him by now to know that when he said something without elaboration, it was because the elaboration was unnecessary. He meant it exactly and only as stated. She said, "Thank you." He said, "Hmm," which she had learned was Cole Reardon, for your welcome. On the 10th day, it rained. They were working the east fence when the sky came down without warning. The particular Oklahoma version, fast and thorough and extremely committed. They ran for the old equipment shed at the edge of the property and stood inside while the rain hammered the tin roof. They stood about 10 feet apart. There was nothing to do, no task, no project. Just the rain and the roof and the two of them in a dry space with no particular reason to keep moving. Cole said, "Where'd you grow up?" She said, "Kansas originally, moved to Denver for medical school and never left." He said, "Family there?" She said, "Younger sister. Parents are gone. You?" He said, "Born here, lived here. Will probably die here." She said, "Is that a complaint?" He thought about that. Then he said, "No." She looked at the rain through the gap in the shed door. She said, "I used to think leaving a place meant you were going somewhere better. Now I wonder if sometimes leaving just means you haven't finished figuring out where you are." He said, "Yeah, just that." But the way he said it had the weight of someone who had thought about the same thing for a long time. When the rain stopped, they went back to the fence. They were working closer together than they had been before. Neither of them had moved toward the other. It had just happened, the way distances change when people have shared a small, dry space and a conversation. That evening at dinner, Danny talked about the wedding venue situation, which had resolved. They'd found a spot an hour outside Tulsa, a place with a barn that had been converted with good light, and his future mother-in-law had approved, which he announced with the relief of someone who had survived a particularly harrowing negotiation. Cole said, "Good." Danny said, "Dad?" She was looking at a yacht club in Oklahoma. "We don't have yachts." Cole said, "Apparently you do now." Danny looked at Maggie. He made a joke. "Write this down. This is historic." Maggie smiled. Genuinely this time. She was smiling more lately. Not a lot. Not constantly. But enough that she noticed it. After dinner, Danny went to call Claire and Cole, and Maggie cleaned the kitchen and the ordinary quiet of it. Dishes going in the rack, the squeak of the faucet being turned off, felt like something she wanted to hold still and look at. She said, "Your son is good." Cole said, "He is." She said, "You did that." He paused in his washing, didn't turn around. Then he continued. He said, "His mother did most of it. I showed up." She said, "Don't sell yourself short." He was quiet. Then he said, "His mother was the one who knew how to love people in the way they needed to be loved, not the way she needed to love them. There's a difference." He paused. "I learned that from watching her do it for 23 years. By the time I understood it well enough to do it myself, she was gone." Maggie held the dish she was drying and looked at the watermarks being toweled off it. She said, "I'm sorry." He said, "So am I." They finished the dishes. She said goodnight and went back to the storage room. She lay on the mattress and looked at the ceiling and thought about what he'd said. The way she needed to love people versus the way they needed to be loved. She thought about her marriage, about the version of herself she'd been for 18 years. Efficient, decisive, always solving, always managing. Derek had needed something different. She'd never asked what. Maybe he had. Maybe she'd just never been able to hear it over the noise of her own certainty. She fell asleep thinking about that. On the 12th day, her hands had their first real calluses. She found them in the morning, the beginning of the hardened skin, on the inside of her palms where the tools had been working on her. She pressed her thumb against one and felt it. Solid there, earned. She sat with that for a moment before getting up. The hands that had held scalpels and inserted lines and delivered news both good and terrible to families in waiting rooms. They were changing, becoming something else, not lesser, just different, adapted. She thought, maybe that's allowed. Maybe being different from what you were isn't the same as being ruined. That night, she sat on the porch steps again. Cole came out and sat in his chair again. The stars again, enormous and numerous and unconcerned. After a long while, she said, "I made a decision in about 15 seconds on a night when I'd been awake for 28 hours. And a man died. And I keep asking myself if I would have made a different decision if I'd slept. And I don't know the answer." Cole didn't say anything for a moment. Then he said, "Would it change anything if you did know?" She thought about it. No, he'd still be gone. He said, "Then maybe the question isn't the right one." She looked at him. "What's the right one?" He thought about that for a moment, long enough that she thought he wasn't going to answer. Then he said, "Maybe the right question is, who are you going to be now?" She sat with that. Not an answer, not comfort, just a redirection, quiet and precise, from someone who had at some point in the last 6 years asked himself the same thing and arrived at this ranch, this fence, this life that didn't look like anything he'd planned and was still in its way, a life. She said, "Is that what you did? Decided who you were going to be?" He said, "I'm still deciding." She looked at him in the dark. He looked out at the field. They sat there until it was late. Neither of them moved toward the other. Neither of them said anything further that night. But when she went inside, she felt the particular weight of something building. slow, deliberate, the way foundations are laid. And she didn't try to name it. She just let it be there. He arrived on a Tuesday. Maggie was in the north pasture when she heard the truck. A county sheriff's vehicle, the kind with the light bar on top and the official seal on the door. She watched it from a distance. She'd been watching for something like this, some part of her, since the first day. She'd known it couldn't stay quiet forever. Cole was in the yard when the truck pulled in. By the time Maggie had crossed the field and reached the edge of the barn where she could hear without being seen, the two men were already talking. The sheriff was a big man, about Cole's age, with an easy way of holding himself that didn't quite disguise the fact that he was here in an official capacity. He and Cole had the body language of people who have known each other for a long time. Familiar but not casual. Because the uniforms and the history between them made casual complicated, the sheriff said, "Cole." Cole said, "Boone, you want coffee?" The sheriff said, "I'm all right, Cole, I'm going to be straight with you. There's a woman being looked for, 47, dark hair, out of Denver. Goes by Margaret Callahan. There's a civil matter attached and a private investigator who's been working the area. Description's a close match to your hired help," Cole said without a beat. "My hired hand came down from Denver about 2 weeks ago. Name's Margaret. She works hard, shows up on time, and I pay her cash. That all you need?" The sheriff was quiet for a moment. He said, "She have documentation?" Cole said, "I didn't ask. I run a cattle operation, not a government office." The sheriff said, "Cole, the man who hired the PI is a lawyer. Name of Derek Callahan. Does that name mean anything to your hired help?" Cole said, "I couldn't say." Another pause. The sheriff said, "This woman's got a medical license issue pending. There's a hearing in Denver. If she doesn't show, it goes bad for her." Cole said, "I appreciate you telling me that." The sheriff said, "Cole?" His voice shifted, not official anymore, just one man talking to his friend. "I'm going to have to come back if this goes further. I don't want to, but you understand my position." Cole said, "I understand it." The sheriff drove away. Cole stood in the yard for a moment. Then he walked to the barn and Maggie stepped out of the shadow. They looked at each other. She said, "I heard." He said, "I know you did." She said, "I should go tonight. There's no reason for you to be pulled into this." He said, "Sit down." She said, "Cole." He said, "Maggie, sit down." The steadiness in his voice had a particular quality, not forceful, just present, like something solid you could put weight on. She sat down on a hay bale, and he sat on the one across from her, and he looked at her straight. He said, "Tell me what actually happened. All of it." She looked at him for a moment. Then she looked at the ground. And she talked. She talked for a long time. She told him about the staffing crisis. 6 written reports, 6 non-responses. A hospital administration that was managing numbers on a spreadsheet rather than people in an emergency room. She told him about the 3rd overnight shift. She told him about Thomas Hale, the specifics of that night, the decisions she'd made, the things she'd missed, the outcome. She told him about Derek, the marriage, the divorce, the way he'd waited for an opportunity with the patience of someone who had a long memory and nothing but time. She told him things she had not told anyone since that night, not because she decided to trust Cole Reardon. She hadn't made that decision consciously. But something in the steadiness of his attention, the way he listened without preparing his response, without trying to direct the story toward an outcome he'd already decided on, made the telling possible in a way it hadn't been elsewhere. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "So you're not hiding from something you did?" She said, "I made a mistake. I own that. But," he said, "but someone took your mistake and built a trap out of it." She said, "Yes." He said, and the trap was built by someone who has more money and more lawyers than you do." She said, "Yes." He said, that's not justice, that's leverage." She looked at him. He said it simply the way he said most things, without dramatics, without performance, just the fact of it, named accurately. She said, "I know, but knowing that doesn't change the outcome." He said, "Might change what you do about it." She didn't answer that. He said, "There's a lawyer I know, Gerald Marsh. Practiced in Tulsa for 30 years, does medical licensing work. You don't have to decide anything tonight. but I'm going to give you his number. She said, Cole, if Derek finds out you've been helping me, that sheriff as much as told you there's exposure. He said, I know what he told me. She said, this isn't your problem. He stood up, looked at her, said, you keep saying that. Then he walked out of the barn and back toward the house. She sat on the hay bale and looked at the space where he'd been. She thought about the word he'd used, leverage. She'd been thinking about it as the legal system, as Derek's superior resources, as the gap between what she could afford to fight and what he could afford to pursue. She hadn't thought of the word leverage, but that's what it was. That's all it was. Someone had found a lever and used it. And someone else, a man she'd known for 2 weeks, a man on a cattle ranch in northwestern Oklahoma, had used the word for it without blinking and then offered her a lawyer's name. She put her face in her hands, not crying, just sitting with it. After a while, she got up and went to help with the evening feeding. That night, Cole made a call. She could hear him through the wall of the storage room, though she couldn't make out the words. Brief. 10 minutes, maybe. Then silence. In the morning, there was a piece of paper on the porch step outside her door. A name and a phone number. Gerald Marsh. Written in ballpoint in Cole's handwriting. The handwriting of someone who spent more time with tools than pens, big and clear, and not particularly elegant. She picked it up and stood in the cold morning air and looked at it. She put it in her coat pocket. Didn't call, not yet. But she kept it. That counted for something. It was the horse that broke the last thing open. Cole had a bay gelding named River, 9 years old, well-trained, the kind of horse that had been part of a family long enough to have a personality, rather than just a temperament. Maggie had worked around him every day, and understood that he had been important to someone in a way that went beyond the practical. Cole spent longer with him than efficiency required. He talked to him, though not in the way Danny talked to him. Danny talked to the horse the way he talked to everyone, which was constantly and with enthusiasm. Cole talked to River in a low voice when he thought no one was listening, in the way you talk to something that holds memory for you. On the 17th day, River went through a loose run of barbed wire in the far pasture. The wound on his front left leg was deep. The horse was in pain and panicking and would not be approached. The nearest large animal vet was 40 miles east, and the road after last night's rain was passable but slow. Cole had his phone out, and Maggie could hear him working through the math of time versus injury. She walked into the pasture. Cole said, Maggie, don't, she said, I know. Same voice, completely different register. The voice she used in trauma bays when everything was going sideways and someone needed to hear certainty, even if certainty was a thing you performed while assembling it in real time. She moved toward River the way she'd learned to approach frightened things, not directly, not fast, from an angle that didn't feel threatening. She talked to him. Low, steady stream. Not words exactly, just sound. She got close enough to see the wound clearly and to put one hand on his neck where the pulse was, feeling it slow slightly under her palm. She said without turning around, Cole, I need you on his left at the head. Hold him exactly the way I show you. Don't let go no matter what he does. Danny said, I'm here. She said, first aid kit in the barn, the big one on the top shelf. Bring everything. They worked for 40 minutes. She cleaned the wound and assessed the depth and closed it in layers with the suture material from the first aid kit and her own hands, which had done this kind of work many times before in many different contexts, though never on a horse. When it was done, River was standing quieter, head lowered. Danny was looking at Maggie with an expression she recognized. It was the expression people wore in the ER when they'd expected chaos and gotten competence instead. He said, Are you a doctor? She stopped. She looked at her hands. The suture material, the blood, the horse's, not a person's, but blood is blood, and the smell is the same, and her hands knew it. She said, I used to be. Cole was looking at her, not with surprise exactly, more like someone who had suspected a thing for a while and was now having it confirmed. Danny said, like, a real doctor? An MD? She said, emergency medicine, 22 years. Danny sat back on his heels and looked at the sky. He said, okay, all right. That tracks, actually. When you told Dad about the cow that first day, I thought—" He stopped. "I thought you sounded like someone who knew more than they were saying." She said, "I did." Cole said, "Disaster relief work. That's where the field skills came from." It wasn't a question. She said, "Haiti after the 2010 earthquake, Texas after Harvey, Puerto Rico after Maria." She paused. "You learn to work with what you have, or you don't, and people die." Cole said, "That's why you survived 7 days by the river." She said, "My body knew how, even when I didn't." They were quiet for a moment. River shifted his weight and put his head down further. The wound was clean and closed, and he was already settling. Cole said, "Why didn't you say?" She said, "Because I wasn't that person anymore. That's why I was by the river." The evening came down around them while they were talking. Danny went to call the vet and report to make sure the aftercare was right. And Maggie and Cole stayed in the barn, the horse between them, the lamp throwing long yellow light. Cole said, "You've been in the worst places on earth, and you ended up sitting by this river for a week." She said, "In those places, I knew who I was. I was the person with the skills and the training and the protocol. I was useful in a way that was visible." She paused. "In Denver, something started to crack. I don't know when exactly, but when it finally broke, I didn't know who was left." He said, "And here?" She looked at her hands, the calluses, the wire cuts, the suture material still on her fingers, the ghost of what she'd just done. She said, "I'm starting to remember." They stayed in the barn a while longer. The horse's breathing evened out. The night insects started up outside. Cole put his hand on her shoulder before he went. 2 seconds, firm. Then he walked out. She stayed in the barn with River and the lamp and the dark, and for the first time the dark didn't feel like it was closing around her. It felt like the ordinary darkness of a late evening in a place where someone had thought to put a hook on a door for her coat. She pressed her hand over the calluses on her palm. These hands. Different now. Harder in some places. More careful in others. She thought, maybe that's what learning looks like at this age. Not starting over. Just becoming a newer version of the same material. Stronger in different places than you expected. She went inside and slept without dreaming, 3 weeks in, the night before Danny left. He'd been going back and forth for days. The wedding preparation was entering the final intense phase, and Claire needed him present for decisions that Danny described as, quote, absolutely incomprehensible in their complexity and seriousness, but which apparently required him to have opinions about napkin colors. He cooked dinner that last evening, an elaborate production involving a pork roast and a green bean situation that he'd clearly looked up online and was following with the focused attention of a man who had committed to a thing. The kitchen was warm and a little loud with his commentary and the radio he'd turned on and the sound of things cooking. Maggie sat at the table and chopped vegetables when directed and thought, I am sitting in someone's kitchen, helping make dinner. I'm doing this naturally. I'm not calculating how this happened. It had happened the way a lot of things happen. One day at a time, one task at a time. One evening on the porch steps at a time. Danny set 3 plates on the table and sat down and said, Okay, first, I think the green beans are slightly too long in the tooth, as they say. Second, I want to say before I go that having you here has been, he looked for the word. Good. It's been good. Dad's different when you're around. Cole said, Eat your dinner, Danny. Danny said, I'm just saying. Cole said, I know what you're saying. Maggie said, The green beans are fine. After dinner, Danny hugged his father for a long time. Cole held his son with both arms in the way of a man who doesn't do that sort of thing often and therefore does it completely when he does. Then Danny turned to Maggie and hugged her too. She hadn't been prepared for it, not emotionally. He just did it. Wrapped his arms around her shoulders the same way he'd hugged his father, without any deliberation, without any uncertainty, as if she'd been part of this family for years, and the hug was simply what was appropriate. She stood in it for a moment and felt something in her chest that she couldn't manage around. Not grief, not exactly. More like memory of warmth. What it felt like to be held by someone who wasn't holding you for a reason. Who was just holding you because you were there and you were theirs. She hugged him back. He said close to her ear, "Take care of him, okay? He's not going to say he needs it." She said, "I know." He got in his truck and drove away. And the taillights disappeared down the road, and then it was just the two of them and the house in the dark. They did the dishes together. She washed, he dried. The radio was still on low in the background. Then Cole turned and reached up to the shelf above the refrigerator and brought down a wooden box she hadn't noticed before. A cassette player, aged. He plugged it in at the counter and slid in a tape and pressed play. Patsy Cline. "She's Got You." He stood with his back to the kitchen for a moment. Then he said to the window rather than to her, "My wife loved this song. Saturday nights we'd dance in here after Danny went to bed." The music played. Old and warm and a little crackled at the edges, the way cassette audio always is. Like something remembered rather than something happening now. Maggie stood at the sink with the dish towel in her hands. Cole turned around and held out his hand. Not a declaration. Not a moment of electricity from a movie. Just a hand held out. An offer. The way you offer a hand to help someone across uneven ground. She looked at it. She thought of every reason to say no. She cycled through them. She was still working for this man. She didn't know what she was doing in 3 weeks. She had a legal situation. She was not in a position to... She put her hand in his. They didn't dance well. They swayed, really, standing in the kitchen that smelled of pork roast and dish soap, each keeping a careful distance. Their steps not quite matching, the song doing most of the work. She didn't count the seconds. She just stood there, in someone's kitchen, in the warm dark, with someone's hand holding hers, and the particular feeling of being held, not saved, not carried, just held, moved through her like something long blocked finally finding a way through. The song ran for 2 minutes and 20 seconds, and then the tape moved on to the next song, and Cole lowered his hand and stepped back. They moved apart as naturally as they'd come together. Nothing was said. They went to sit on the porch. The October night was cold now, proper cold, the kind that made the stars look closer. Maggie said, looking at the dark, "His name was Thomas Hale. He was 61. He had 3 daughters. I know their names because I read them in the paperwork after." Cole was still. She said, "He came in with acute chest pain. I made a medication call. I had information from his chart and from what the family told the paramedics. There was a drug interaction listed in a database that the hospital system was supposed to flag. It didn't flag. I didn't go looking for it because I was on hour 28 of a shift that should have ended at 16. And I'd made the best decision I could with what was in front of me." She stopped, restarted. She said, "He died at 3:44 in the morning. And I stood in the bathroom afterward and looked in the mirror, and the person looking back at me was a stranger." She said, "I've been asking for 3 months whether I killed him, whether it was my mistake or the system's mistake or both, whether a better doctor would have found that interaction, whether a rested doctor would have, whether I should have refused the 3rd shift, whether refusing would have made any difference." Cole said, "Did he know you were trying?" She said, "Yes. He looked at me while I was working. He nodded, like he was trying to tell me he understood what was happening." Cole said, "Then that's what he took with him. Not what you think he took. Not your mistake, not the system's failure. That you were there and you were trying." She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "I've been carrying this the wrong way." Cole said, "Most people do." She said, "You sound like someone who knows." He said, "I do know." She waited. He didn't say more, but she felt the weight of it in those 3 words. The same weight she'd felt in the first time he'd said, "I know that feeling." Whatever he was carrying, it was the same shape as hers. Different contents, same shape. She didn't push. Some things have to be offered before they can be received. She said, "Thank you for not telling me it wasn't my fault." He said, "I don't know if it was or wasn't. That's not mine to say." She said, "Thank you for not saying it anyway." They sat until midnight. The cold deepened. The stars moved. And then, 3 days later, the world broke through. Boone Travis drove up on a Friday morning, and the look on his face when he got out of the truck told Maggie everything she needed to know before he opened his mouth. He took Cole aside. She was near enough to hear. Boone said, "Cole, Derek Callahan filed a complaint with the county attorney's office this morning, alleging you've been knowingly harboring someone under active civil investigation. Depending on how it develops, you could be looking at a charge." The silence after that was the loudest thing Maggie had ever heard. Cole said, "I understand." Boone said, "I like you, Cole. You know that. I'm not here to arrest anybody, but you need to understand what this is now." Boone left. Cole came to find her. He held out the summons, her Denver summons, which Boone had brought as well. 72 hours. Appear in Denver or face a bench warrant. He put the paper in her hand and looked at her. She read it. She understood it. And then the old self arrived, the one that had learned early that the safest thing in a crisis was to stop needing things from people, to retract, to manage it alone. She said, "I'll go tonight. You won't be involved." He said, "That's not what I was going to say." She said, "Cole, this has gone far enough. He's coming after you now. That's my fault. I should have left." He said, "Stop." She said louder, "I never asked you to get involved in this." The sentence landed hard. They both felt it. She knew it was wrong while she was saying it. Not factually wrong. She hadn't asked him. Not in so many words. But wrong in every way that mattered. Because she had been here for 3 weeks, and she had sat on the porch steps and told him things she'd told no one. And he had stayed. And the truth was, she had needed that. She had needed exactly that. Cole stepped back. He looked at her for a moment. Then he walked outside and left the door open. She stood in the kitchen and listened to the silence. She went to the storage room and sat on the mattress. She didn't pack. She thought she would. And then she sat down and her hands stayed still in her lap. She looked at the hook on the door. She looked at the wool blanket folded on the chair. She looked at the small window in the field beyond and the sky above that. She sat for a very long time. Then she picked up her phone. She'd been charging it in the storage room for 2 weeks, avoiding it, using it only for the alarm. And she called her sister. Her sister answered on the second ring, voice tight with worry that had been accumulating for weeks. Maggie said, "Hey, I'm sorry I disappeared. I'm okay. I need a few more days." She paused. "I wanted you to know I haven't given up. I just had to remember what I was fighting for." Her sister said, "Maggie, where are you?" Maggie looked at the Oklahoma stars through the small window. She said, "Somewhere I needed to be. I'll call you in the morning." She hung up. She sat in the quiet and let herself ask, for the first time, honestly, without the interference of obligation or habit or fear, what she actually wanted. Not what she should do, what she wanted. The answer was so clear it was almost embarrassing. She wanted to be here. She wanted to stay, and she was done running from the things she wanted. She found the letter in the morning. It was on the porch step outside her door, folded once, her name on the front in ballpoint. Cole's handwriting, large and clear and not elegant. She sat down on the step in the cold morning air and unfolded it. He had written about Ellen. Not about the ranch or the legal situation or what to do next, about his wife. He had written, "Ellen died on a Wednesday night at 11:47. I was working a traffic accident 6 miles away. My phone rang 3 times from the hospital number. I looked at the screen and I thought, 1 more minute, I'm almost done here." He had written, "I didn't answer." He had written, "I got there at 12:31. She had been gone for 44 minutes, and I have carried that for 6 years and told no one." He had written, "I'm not telling you this so you'll stay. I'm telling you because you deserve to know that the man who keeps suggesting you face things has not always faced the things in front of him. I know what you're carrying because the shape of it is familiar, and I know it doesn't go away. But I also know that the carrying gets different over time if you let it. At the bottom, in smaller letters, you don't owe me anything. You never did." She sat on the step with the letter for a long time. The sun came up over the field. The cattle began to move. Somewhere in the barn, River shifted in his stall and the wood of the walls creaked. She folded the letter and put it in her coat pocket. Then she went to work. She'd been up for an hour already, actually. She'd woken at 4:30, unable to sleep, and rather than lie in the dark, she'd gotten up and gone to the barn. She'd cleaned both stalls, she'd fed the cattle. She'd gone to the east fence and fixed the 3 weak posts that Cole had been meaning to get to for weeks. She'd been watching him almost get to them for 12 days, and she knew where the tools were, and she knew what needed to be done. By the time Cole came out at 6, the morning work was finished. He stood in the yard and looked at the cleaned barn and the fed cattle and the fence line that was different than it had been yesterday. She was standing in the middle of the yard, mud on her boots, hands rough, looking straight at him. She said, "I read your letter." He said nothing, waited. She said, "I'm not leaving because I'm afraid. Not anymore. But I can't stay if you don't actually want me here. Not as the person you found by the river. Not out of obligation. Not because you think someone should." She stopped. "I need it to be a real choice. Yours." The morning was very quiet, a bird somewhere, the cattle settling. Cole said, "I haven't slept right in 6 years. Since you got here, I sleep." She looked at him. He said, "You can call that whatever you want, but that's the truth of it." She picked up the phone. She called Gerald Marsh. When he answered, she said, "My name is Margaret Callahan. I'm a physician. I have a hearing in Denver in 3 days, and I need to tell someone the whole truth. All of it. Not the version that protects me. The actual version." Marsh said, "All right, let's start from the beginning." She talked for an hour. She told him everything. The staffing reports, the shifts, the decision, the things she'd missed, what she should have caught and why she didn't, what Derek had done with it, and how. She answered every question without flinching away from the answers that hurt. When she was done, Marsh was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Dr. Callahan, I've been doing this for 30 years. What I'm hearing is a physician who made a defensible call under indefensible working conditions. That's not nothing. The board will hear that." She said, "I need you to know I'm not looking for a verdict. I just want to tell the truth in the room where it matters." He said, "That's actually the best thing you can walk in with." She hung up and sat at the kitchen table for a few minutes. Cole came in and poured 2 cups of coffee, his bad version, which she had completely stopped noticing was bad, and set one in front of her and sat down. She said, "I have a hearing on Monday." He said, "I know." She said, "I'm going to go." He said, "I'll drive you." She said, "Cole, it's 600 miles. He said, "I know how far it is." She looked at him across the kitchen table. The morning light was coming in the window at the angle it always did this time of day, landing on the corner of the table and on his hands wrapped around the mug. She said, "You don't have to." He said, "I know." She said, "Why then?" He said, "Because you shouldn't go alone." She thought about arguing. She thought about independence and competence and all the reasons she had spent a long time being a person who handled things alone. Then she thought about 7 days by the river, about a bread roll on a flat rock, about a wool blanket and a hook on a door, and 3 words, "I know that feeling," said at midnight with no agenda attached. She said, "Okay." He said, "We leave at 5." She said, "I'll be ready." She went back to the storage room and looked around at what she'd made of it. The 3 weeks of living in it had given it a quality it hadn't had when she arrived. Not home-like exactly, something between provisional and earned. She packed her bag, not running this time, preparing. She put Gerald Marsh's number in her phone. She put her sister's number back in her favorites where it belonged. She held Cole's letter in her hand for a moment and then folded it carefully and put it in the inside pocket of her jacket, close. She was ready. They drove through the night and arrived in Denver at 11 in the morning. The city looked different from the passenger seat of Cole's truck. She'd spent 16 years here. She knew every hospital, every highway exchange, every neighborhood. She'd thought leaving it, even involuntarily, even the way she'd left it, would feel like loss. Instead, it just looked like a city. Concrete and glass, and a lot of people who didn't know her. She'd been carrying Denver in her chest for 3 months like a wound. From the outside, it was just geography. Cole parked in a lot 3 blocks from the medical board building. He fed quarters into the meter. He'd brought quarters. He'd thought ahead, which she found unexpectedly moving. She said, "You don't have to come in." He said, "I'll wait out here." She said, "It could be hours." He said, "I brought coffee." She looked at him. He said, "The real kind. From that place we passed on 270. She said, "Cole." He said, "Go. You've got a room to speak in. Use it." She went. The hearing room was smaller than she'd expected. 6 board members at a long table. Derek Callahan on one side, suited and composed, with 2 associates. The Hale family seated in the gallery, 3 women in their 30s, the daughters, all with the same dark hair as the photograph she'd seen in the file. She sat at the petitioner's table with Gerald Marsh, and she did not look at Derek. She looked at the board members. Marsh presented first, a careful, methodical laying out of the timeline and the conditions. Then Derek presented his case. He was as good as she'd known he would be, precise, credentialed, entirely without drama. The document trail he'd built was formidable. Then Marsh said, "Dr. Callahan would like to address the board directly." She stood up. She said, My name is Margaret Callahan. I practiced emergency medicine for 22 years. On the night in question, I had been on shift for 28 hours because the hospital was critically understaffed, a condition I had formally reported 6 times in the preceding 3 months. That is documented. The staffing records are in the supplemental materials Mr. Marsh submitted. She said, I made a medication decision in a time-critical situation with the information I had. There was a drug interaction I did not find. I should have found it. I was the physician on duty, and that responsibility belongs to me. She paused. She said, but the responsibility for the conditions under which I made that decision does not belong only to me. A hospital that receives 6 written reports about dangerous understaffing and takes no action has accepted part of that responsibility. This board should know that. She said, I am not here to avoid consequences. I am here because I have a right to tell this story in my own words. And I am telling it truthfully, including the parts that reflect badly on me. She sat down. There was a recess. During the recess, Gerald Marsh said to her quietly, I have something. I wasn't sure I was going to be able to use it, but the board chair agreed to hear it. He opened his briefcase. The family's estate attorney found this when they were processing Mr. Hale's personal documents. It's a recorded statement he made about 8 months before his death, during an estate planning session. He talked about a lot of things. At one point, he talked about you. She stared at him. He said, the family has agreed to let the board hear it. The recording was played in the room. Thomas Hale's voice was measured and warm. He spoke about his daughters. He spoke about the ranch he'd grown up on in New Mexico, and about what he wanted for his grandchildren someday. And then, at a certain point, he said, I want to say something about the medical people in my life. There was a doctor. She worked nights at Denver General. I saw her once about 8 months ago for a chest thing that turned out to be nothing serious. She was the most exhausted person I'd ever seen still working. Not careless exhausted, devoted exhausted. The kind of exhausted that comes from caring more than the job allows for. I thought about her sometimes after that. I thought, there's someone doing the work that needs doing because she believes it matters. I hope someone takes care of her the way she was taking care of everybody else. Silence in the room. Maggie sat with her hands flat on the table and looked at the space in front of her. It wasn't the verdict. It wasn't legal testimony. It didn't change the evidentiary record. But Thomas Hale had said, there is someone doing the work that needs doing because she believes it matters. He had seen her. He had seen her clearly, in one visit 8 months before the night that changed everything. And what he'd seen was not negligence, not recklessness, not the ruin that Derek had been building a case around for 3 months. He'd seen a person trying. She was very still for a long time. Then she thought, the right question isn't who you were, it's who you're going to be now. The board deliberated for an hour and 40 minutes. Their decision, license suspended an additional 6 months, pending full investigation, not revoked. The substance abuse allegation dismissed entirely. No evidence. A separate inquiry opened into hospital working conditions. Not a Hollywood ending, not a complete exoneration. 6 more months of uncertainty and process and the long, slow work of rebuilding. But the truth had been told. In the room where it mattered. In her own words. She walked out of the building into the gray Denver afternoon. Cole was leaning against the truck in the no parking zone where he'd apparently moved it at some point during the 4 hours she'd been inside. He had a coffee cup in each hand. She walked across the sidewalk and took one. She said, "They didn't revoke it. 6 more months suspended, then full review." He said, "Okay." She said, "Derek's complaint was dismissed. No evidence." He said, "Good." She said, "They're investigating the hospital." He said, "That's what should happen." She held the coffee cup with both hands. She said, "There was a recording. Thomas Hale made a recording before he died for unrelated reasons. He mentioned me." Cole looked at her. She said, "He said I was the most devoted, exhausted person he'd ever seen still working. He said he hoped someone was taking care of me." Cole was quiet. She said, "He saw me. He saw me the way I was actually trying to be, not the way I was failing to be, and he wanted someone to take care of me." She looked at Cole. She looked at this man who had come 600 miles and parked in a no-parking zone and brought 2 cups of coffee, not one, because it had apparently not occurred to him that she might not want him there. She said, "You've been making choices since the day you found me. Every single one of them has been toward me. Not for your benefit, just toward me." He said, "That's generally how choices work, when they're real ones." She stepped forward and put her arms around him, just held on. He put his arms around her and held back, and the way she'd come to understand was his way. Completely, without reservation, the way he did things he didn't do often. She said into his shoulder, "I want to come back." He said, "I know." She said, "I have 6 months of process here. I'm going to have to be here some of that time." He said, "I can drive 600 miles more than once." She pulled back and looked at him, his face in the gray city light, the same face that had looked down at her from horseback on the morning of day 7, with the same steadiness, the same quality of paying full attention. She said, "Why?" He said, "Same reason I stopped my horse." She said, "You thought I was a brush fire." The corner of his mouth moved. "I knew pretty quick you weren't a brush fire." She laughed. Actually laughed, the real kind, unexpected, a little surprised by itself. He said, "Come on, we should drive back before dark." She said, "Cole." He said, "Yeah." She said, "Thank you for stopping your horse." He looked at her for a moment, then he said, "Thank you for still being there." They got in the truck. She watched Denver get smaller in the side mirror as they drove west. The highway opened up and the city fell away, and the sky got wider and wider until it was the full, enormous Oklahoma-bound sky she'd been living under for 3 weeks, without fully appreciating that it had been doing something to her. She put her hand on the seat between them, palm up. He put his hand in hers. They drove west into the evening. 6 months went by. They weren't simple months. There were trips back to Denver, 3 of them, Cole driving every time, which she stopped arguing with after the first one. There were depositions and paperwork and a separate legal proceeding that resulted in Derek Callahan receiving a bar inquiry of his own for methods that, once examined fully, were not quite as clean as they had appeared. That inquiry went on for a long time. It was not swift. Justice, Maggie was learning or relearning, is rarely swift. The hospital investigation produced a report that was 72 pages long and recommended significant changes to staffing protocols. Several administrators left. A new chief of emergency medicine was appointed. Maggie gave a recorded statement that was referenced 14 times in the report. She read her name in it and felt something she could only call accounted for. Gerald Marsh called her on a Thursday in April to tell her that the medical board had completed its investigation and had voted to reinstate her license with a formal letter of concern, not a black mark but a record, and the recommendation that she pursue a period of supervised practice before returning to independent clinical work. She was sitting on the porch of the Reardon Ranch when she got the call. The morning was warm. The cattle were in the south pasture. River was standing at the fence, which she'd taken to doing lately when she was outside. because she had developed the habit of bringing him an apple when she passed. She said to Gerald Marsh, "Thank you for everything." He said, "You did the hard part." She hung up and sat with it for a while. Then Cole came out and sat in the other chair. She said, "Reinstated." He said, "Good." She said, "I want to start a rural clinic. There are communities about 12 miles east that haven't had reliable medical access for years. I've been looking into the licensing requirements for a rural health designation." He was quiet for a moment. She said, "I know that means..." He said, "I know what it means." She said, "I'd need to stay." He said, "Maggie?" She said, "What?" He said, "I put a new lock on the storage room door, replaced the old one. You've been here 8 months. It seemed right to upgrade the hardware." She looked at him. He said, "Also, I was wondering if you wanted the actual bedroom. We can move the furniture around." She said, "Cole..." He said, "The storage room is fine if you want the storage room. I just thought..." She said, "Ask me." He stopped. He looked at her. This man with his rough hands and his few words and his letters written in ballpoint and his quarters for parking meters and his 600-mile drives and his way of standing exactly close enough. He said, "Will you stay? Not the storage room. Stay." She said, "Yes." The word came out easy, clean, like something that had been waiting a long time to be said and had finally found the right moment. He nodded, got up, went back inside. She sat on the porch and looked at the morning and felt something she recognized after a long absence as the particular quality of a day that belongs to you. Danny's wedding was in May. A converted barn an hour outside Tulsa, exactly as he'd described, with good light coming in through tall windows and a bluegrass band that played old standards with the kind of enthusiasm that makes up for technical imperfection. Claire was wonderful. Maggie met her properly for the first time that day. A small, bright woman with the organizational precision of someone who had clearly been doing event management since childhood, and the warm eyes of someone who would be good for Danny in the ways he most needed. She hugged Maggie at the reception and said, "Danny told me about you. He said you fixed his dad." Maggie said, "That's not quite right." Claire said, "He said you reminded his dad that there was something to fix for." Maggie was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "That might be slightly more accurate." The minister at the ceremony was old and unhurried, and he said something during the vows that Maggie wrote down on a napkin afterward. "Love is not a thing you fall into and find. It is a thing you choose, and then choose again every ordinary day, whether the choosing is easy or whether it costs you something." She put the napkin in her jacket pocket. Cole was sitting beside her in the front row. She felt him take her hand during the vows. Not dramatically, just quietly, his hand finding hers the way water finds its level. She held on. The reception was long and good. Danny danced badly with enormous commitment. Ruth McAllister appeared from somewhere and ate 3 pieces of cake without apology. Boone Travis shook Cole's hand and then unexpectedly shook Maggie's too and said, "I want you to know I'm glad it worked out the way it did." She said, "So am I." He said, "For what it's worth, Cole's the best man I know. Has been since we were 25 and dumb about everything. He doesn't make choices he doesn't mean." She said, "I know that now." The clinic opened in September. It was small, 3 exam rooms, a waiting area that could hold 8 people if they were comfortable with proximity, and a supply room that Maggie organized with the thoroughness of someone who had spent 3 years working disaster relief and knew that the difference between prepared and unprepared was the difference between good outcomes and bad ones. She hired a nurse practitioner named Beverly, who had been driving 30 miles each way to the nearest hospital for her shifts, and who, when Maggie described what she was building, said, "When do I start?" The first week they saw 42 patients, the second week 61. There were people who had been managing chronic conditions with over-the-counter medications for years, because the nearest doctor was a 40-mile round trip that required a day off work. There were children who had never seen a pediatrician. There were older men and women with the particular stoic pride of people who do not ask for help unless it becomes absolutely necessary, and who had, in many cases, waited past necessary. Maggie worked afternoons at the clinic and mornings at the ranch. She had a sign on her clinic door that said, "No appointment necessary, no insurance required, pay what you can." She had not asked Cole what he thought of the sign before she put it up. He had driven past it twice before he mentioned it. He said, "No insurance required." She said, "There are people out here who need care and can't navigate the insurance system. I'm not going to let that be the reason they don't get it." He said, "I know, I think it's right." She said, "I didn't ask." He said, "No, you didn't." Pause. He said, "That's one of the things I like about you." She looked at him. He was already walking away. She made a sound that was somewhere between a laugh and not a laugh. On a Sunday in October, a year after she'd arrived, they walked to the river. Same river. Same fog lying low on the water in the early morning. Same October cold that settles into your shoulders and stays there without announcing itself. She stood on the bank and looked at the place where the camp had been. There was nothing there now. Nature had reclaimed whatever evidence she'd left. The flat rock was still there. Just a rock. Cole stood beside her. She said, "Do you remember what you were thinking when you saw me, that first day?" He said, "I thought you were a brush fire." She said, "Before you knew, I wasn't." He thought about it. He said, "I thought, that's someone at the end of something. And I couldn't leave that alone." She said, "Why?" He said, "Because I'd been at the end of something for 6 years, and I knew what it looked like. And I knew what it felt like when someone didn't stop." She looked at him. He said, "My father used to say, you don't have to fix what's broken for another person, but you can stand close enough that the breaking doesn't happen in the dark." She said, "He was right." Cole said, "He was right about most things. Took me a while to admit it." She slipped her hand into his. They stood at the edge of the Cimarron River in the October morning fog and watched the water move. She said, "I wrote my sister a letter last week." He said, "You told me." She said, "I told her I was happy, and then I sat there looking at the word and I thought, is that the right one? Is happy what this is?" He said, "What did you decide?" She said, "I decided it's the right one, but it's a different kind of happy than I thought happy was supposed to feel. It's not bright. It's not exciting. It's more like solid, like standing on ground that holds." He said, "That's the better kind." She said, "I think so too." The fog was lifting. The October light was coming in low and gold over the flat Oklahoma land. In the distance, the cattle were beginning to move. River was probably at the fence by now, waiting. She said, "Thomas Hale said he hoped someone would take care of me." Cole said, "I know." She said, "He got his wish." They stood there while the morning arrived around them. Unhurried, ordinary, full of the particular beauty of a day in a life that is genuinely being lived rather than simply endured. She had spent 7 days on this riverbank thinking her story was ending. She had not known it was starting. She held Cole's hand and felt the calluses on her palm. The new ones, the earned ones, the ones that told the story of who she'd become in this unlikely place. And she thought about Thomas Hale saying devoted, exhausted. She thought about Danny saying take care of him. She thought about Ruth counting the early mornings. She thought about a wool blanket on a flat rock and 3 words, "I know that feeling," and the particular courage of a man who stops his horse when he doesn't have to. She thought, this is what a life looks like when you stop running and turn around and choose it. The river moved. The morning held. She was here. She had chosen to come back. And that, after everything, after all of it, made all the difference in the world. All characters and situations in this book are fictional and developed for narrative purposes. The author does not intend to reflect or comment on any real individual or event. Readers should approach the story as a work of fiction, not as a factual account.
There is a moment in this story that I want you to hold on to. A man on horseback, a woman in the mud, 7 days of silence and hunger and the particular kind of despair that comes not from weakness, but from caring too much for too long in a world that forgot to care back. He could have ridden on. Nobody would have blamed him. It was his land. She was a stranger. The law was on his side and common sense was too. But he stopped. And he asked 4 words that changed everything. Have you eaten anything today? Not who are you? Not what are you doing here? Not what did you do wrong? Just have you eaten? Because before anything else, before the story and the judgment and the complicated truth of how a person ends up sitting alone by a river on day 7, she was a human being who needed food. That is the first lesson this story carries, and it is the most important one. The way you see a person in their worst moment tells you everything about who you are, and nothing about who they are. Cole Reardon didn't know Maggie's name. He didn't know her history. He saw someone at the end of something, and he chose to see a person rather than a problem. That choice, small, quiet, unheroic, is the choice that saved her life. Not dramatically, not all at once, but truly. The second lesson is about dignity. Cole didn't hand Maggie charity. He offered her work. He offered her a reason to get up in the morning that had nothing to do with pity and everything to do with respect. There is a profound difference between being given something and being given the chance to earn something. One says, "You are less than me, so I will help you." The other says, "You are my equal, so let us help each other." Every human being in crisis needs the second kind. Almost nobody gives it. The third lesson belongs to both of them equally. Cole had been carrying his own wound for 6 years, the 44 minutes he wasn't there when Ellen needed him most. Maggie had been carrying hers for 3 months. Neither of them could heal alone. Not because they were weak, because healing, real healing, requires a witness. It requires someone to sit beside you in the dark and say, "I know that feeling." Not to fix it, not to explain it away, just to know it and stay. And finally, this story asks us a question worth sitting with long after it ends. When was the last time you stopped your horse? When was the last time someone was clearly struggling, and instead of looking away, because you were busy, because it wasn't your problem, because you didn't know what to say, you simply asked, "Have you eaten anything today?" The Western landscape teaches a particular kind of truth. Out here, in the wide open, there is nowhere to hide from what matters. You either show up for people or you don't. You either make the choice or you ride on. Cole Reardon made the choice. And that in the end, in every story worth telling, is the whole of it.